Well, hey, friends, welcome to Awakening's Ask a Scholar podcast. This is where you, the everyday Christian, can get your questions about the Bible answered by a biblical scholar. I'm Carla.
And I'm Mike, and we're both glad that you decided to join our discussion. So let's dive in.
Well, welcome everybody to episode 10. We are back again answering more questions on the book of Deuteronomy. And again, we have with us Dr. Ronn Johnson. So thank you for being a part of a second episode.
Good to be here again.
Awesome. Well, I know we kind of all know who you are. And so let's just dive right into questions so that you and Mike can get to discussing some of these answers. So the first question that we have for today's episode says, why does God justify and command holy war throughout the book of Deuteronomy?
Great question. It's been talked about, of course, for centuries. And first, I'm not aware, let me show you a slide. I'm not aware of any author who talks about holy war with a divine council worldview intact or in place, except for Dr. Heiser in his Unseen Realm. He gets into it. But Here are three books I just pulled off my shelf when I went looking, at home here. God is a Warrior came out by, Tremper Longman. This new one, Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric, is brand new, came out last year. None of them even gave, and I went through each one of them very carefully to look for any sign of a divine council worldview, and none of them had it. Then there is another book that just came out. I'll go back to the slide again. It's called Show Them No Mercy, 4 Views on God in Canaanite Genocide. So and I love 4 view books or 5 view books because they allow an author to give a view and then the other authors respond. Mm-hmm. Look at, and I'll show this, I think, up close and personal. Yeah, there it is. This is by... within the book. Okay, so now we even have a 4 views book that we can look at. And I looked all through this book for any sense of a divine council worldview. Look at what I underlined. Yahweh war then is essentially war against the imaginary gods of the world. Okay.
Wow.
Here is another one. Since the God they worship has no existence except in their imaginations. Idols are the construction of human futility. Stark distinction between the one and the only true God and human representations of false gods. For Israel to acknowledge and worship these imaginary deities would be corrupting. So nowhere in and I'm all done with my slide there, but nowhere in any of the modern conversations about holy war that I'm aware of, and Mike, if you can find it, let me know, no one is taking into account, shockingly, the idea that the gods of the Old Testament are real. To me, that's the first question to discuss. If I've been told to go in and wipe out a certain people group, I would ask God why. Mm-hmm. And if it turns out that there's a other God issue at work there, then boy, at least I should consider it. So, by the way, this is a good example of the divine council worldview. Not that people have tried it and found it wanting. Most people have never even tried it. And I'd recommend that's why it's not popular yet. People just haven't thought through it. Mm-hmm. So my understanding of Deuteronomy's holy war begins all the way back in Genesis, where in chapter 9, verse 25, Canaan is cursed, with the close context of the which Elohim question in mind, when it says, the next verse, blessed be Yahweh, the Elohim of Shem. So cursed be Canaan, blessed be Shem, and I think it's based on the God they worshipped. So Canaan seems to have been a non-Yahwist. Then in 10:15 of Genesis, the sons of Canaan are given some ink. And it says the Jebusite, the Amorite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, those 4 people groups, the sons of Canaan. Now when you then flip up to Deuteronomy 7, which we get into the point of the haram, or the banning or the destruction of Canaan, those 4 names lead off the list: Jebusite, Amorite, Girgashite, and Hivite. So I think the reader, if he had been very careful and had known his Torah well, he would have connected those names, those people groups, back to the Canaan man, the guy Canaan, who was cursed by God way back in Genesis 9. And then in Deuteronomy 20, the other text that we often associate with this destruction, the verb is repeated, that destruction verb in verse 17, and with 3 of those people groups mentioned again. And then Moses adds for clarity, let nothing that breathes remain alive. And he's talking there about the inheritance that Israel is about to get. So if you're putting all that together, this destruction of everything that breathes has to do with gaining their inheritance. It's not just being wealthy and getting land, for your crops. This is the promise of Genesis 12 coming true. And that is that if you're going to get what I'm going to give you, you're going to have to clean out what's there. And there's a specific issue. And then this now goes back to Deuteronomy 9 to get this. And it includes the phrase, giving you this land, the same specific area. But then in verses 1 and 2, Deuteronomy 1 and 2, it says, a people great and tall, descendants of the Anakim. So I think, it's my opinion, that the holy war of Deuteronomy was not a general call to kill people. In fact, in Deuteronomy 20, verse 11, you're told to ask for peace first, but was instead focused on specific clans. And I think you can find, well, no, and you certainly can find evidence that it's the Anakim and Rephaim, occasionally the Amorites as well. And that Joshua's intent for Israel was that they would inherit their land by getting rid of the Anakim. So I would just say that, and then in one more thing, when you get to Joshua 11 and you have this interesting, the first 10 chapters of Joshua are the actual conquest. And then you have kind of a summary at the end of chapter 11 before you divide the land in chapters 12 through 24. At the end of Joshua 11, listen how he describes the conquest. Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel, only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. And of course, that's where Goliath comes from. And the land had rest from war. So, very clear to me that the how the conquest was defined as a success was because of the elimination of the Anakim from the hill country. So, to me, that's the holy war. It's destroying. Remember how in our previous Q&A we talked about the Anakim and the Rephaim.
Right.
They're related to the Nephilim. So
Right.
whatever's going on, and I know it's weird. I understand that, but to them, they had a very real vision or understanding that the gods had infiltrated the world in some very real way, and these people groups, called specifically Anakim and Rephaim, were to be rooted out in order for the inheritance to be gained. So that's what I find about my answer. And Mike, I'm happy to hear yours. It's so simple. It's just like, well, it's right there in the text. It says, once they got rid of the Anakim, the land had rest. And why these books that I showed here don't even reference it. Again, it's not as though they tried it and found it wanting. They never even went down the path of asking the question, are these gods real? So that's my answer.
So to answer, well, a question you mentioned as you're speaking, Ron, there is a book, and Carla, you and I will hopefully be talking with him and another scholar for the next set of episodes on Ask a Scholar. But Dr. Matthew Lynch wrote a book called Flood and Fury, and addressing the question about the Old Testament violence that's often seen. And he does talk about the word harem, that's normally translated like devoted to destruction. He even mentions the origins of the giants and really the kind of that ancient Near Eastern kind of idea that there are other gods and such. Some of the stuff that he mentions in his book is he's talking about how harem is a word that is not necessarily just about genocide. More likely, it's actually a word that's connected to worship or liturgical worship. And I remember there's also another resource that I read recently from John Walton, where he also dived into the meaning of the word harem, that it doesn't necessarily mean to kill or to exterminate, but that it essentially means to essentially render powerless. So the whole idea is, as you were saying, Ron, earlier, about how they needed to push out the Anakim, the Rephaim, and if possible, try to make peace first. If that doesn't happen, then there has to be some sort of pushing them away and out of the land. And Dr. Lynch, in his book, he points out that one of the reasonings for this is that the worship of the other giant clans and really the other Canaanites, that those were temptations. And we know from the history of just even from the book of Numbers and the book of Exodus, that the people of Israel were always tempted to worship other gods. And so there was this desire that the pushing is to actually ensure loyalty to Yahweh alone, that they would not be tempted to worship other deities, other gods, the other religions that were surrounding them from the Canaanites that were there.
Mhm.
And so I think that's part of the justification, is that to take away the temptation, to take away the fact that people, God's people, were prone to worship other deities. I would almost put it to akin that it's a very harsh set of language, but it's the same kind of thing you would expect from a person that's recovering from being an alcoholic. That if they're in like the 12-step program, I mean, especially at the very beginning of it, one of the things that they would do is they would purge out everything in their home that would be connected to alcohol. They would disconnect their friendships, people who love to go to the bars. They would have to radically reorient their lives in order to remove the possibility of these temptations of drawing them back into a very destructive pattern. And in many ways, I see what's going on with here is that God is essentially knowing we need to remove this, because the people of Israel have shown there's a tendency to keep on worshiping other gods. The fact that there is even mention of goat demons that the people were apparently sacrificing to. That you have this pattern that's still happening even while they're wandering through the desert.
Yeah, that's good. And Mike,
Thank you.
real quick, while we're on this, name those resources again that you said mention this concept, and they kind of, at least make mention that the gods were real.
So I would recommend Dr. Matthew Lynch's book, Flood and Fury, Old Testament Violence and the Shalom of God, and the particular John Walton book that I am thinking of is The Lost World of the Israelite Conquests, where he
Okay.
also
Oh, he has
mentions
that one
about,
out too, huh? Okay. Well, I've not
yes, and
gotten that
so
yet.
but that goes into a really kind of the newer research that's been coming around with the word harem, that it's not necessarily about extermination, but
Right.
that it's actually about rendering useless or ineffective. And so thus, by the end of the Joshua conquests, there are still Canaanites in the land, but they're no longer the majority and they're no longer the power players.
Yeah.
And so essentially, Joshua did accomplish most of his goal. It's just that there are cities where the remnants of these groups still ended up in, such as Gath, where eventually descendants and a lineage would grow, where you have Goliath, who pops up in 1 Samuel, who happens to be from Gath. And so there is this interesting thing that Joshua was not completely successful, but for the most part, he did render the majority of the land
Yeah.
of the Canaanite clans, especially of the giant clans, that they were rendered ineffective, that they were not able to now push back against the Israelites.
Yeah. That's great. Okay, great. Well, let's jump to this next question. It's a little bit long, so hang with me as I read it. It says in Deuteronomy 19:15, it says, "A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established." Then he or she goes on to say, one of the external references given is John 8:17, which says, "In your law it is written that a testimony of 2 people is true." I then read the whole section of John 8:12 through 30, and I got totally lost in trying to understand what the connection to Deuteronomy 19:15 is, since this section seems to be more about a dispute Jesus is having with the Pharisees around his identity. Can you shed some light on how these are related? Also puzzling to me was that he said your law instead of the law. And then they end the question with help. So please help this person.
Yeah, let's do our best to help. And go ahead and show a slide that I have here. It's of John 8:13 to 20. The context is basically verses 42 to 44, which I don't have on the screen, and that's Jesus' audience being called out as of the devil. So
Mm.
it's a fascinating moment where Jesus is dealing with Jews, and he's naming them out for being non-Yahwists right on the spot, and that I'm sure shocked the crowd. But it's to that crowd of non-Yahwists that he's speaking when he says, and let's look at the slide there. The Pharisees said, "You are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true." In other words, they're claiming, "Hey, we know that Deuteronomy 19 says that the only way to really bear witness of or to be true in a court of law is to have two or three witnesses,
Mm-hmm.
defend you." And so the Pharisees' point of 8:13 is you only have yourself, and Jesus' point in verses 14 to all the way down to 18 is, well, you've got me and the Father who sent me, verse 17. And then in verse 17, in your law it is written. So that in your law, I think, is just for emphasis. Like when a policeman stops you for having a headlight out and his headlight is out, you'd want to say, hey, doesn't your law say that da da da? In other words, it's just emphasizing
Mm-hmm.
that we both have the law, but your law is really getting you more than me at this point. So when he says the Father sent me, bears witness of me, he's just saying, now that's two of us. That's me and the Father. So Deuteronomy 19 is now 19:15 is now being followed by the mouth of two or three witnesses. And I've got two. I've got myself and I've got the Father. So
So
that would be
essentially, this passage is using the rules or the laws in Deuteronomy 19 to state the case that Jesus is making. Is that what you're saying?
right. And it's to the questioner's point. It is about the question of Jesus' identity. That's exactly
Okay.
the point.
Mhm.
So he's claiming to be someone very, very, very special,
Mm-hmm.
and they're doubting it. And he's saying, "Well, I've got two to, two to defend me." So, yeah,
That's helpful.
Yeah, there is an interesting note here from G.K. Beale's commentary on the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. He does mention it's referencing, Deuteronomy 19, and he does, and Ron, you'll probably love this. There may be a hint of deity in Jesus. I am statements in chapter 8, 24, and verse 28. Right? It's anyways, we can avoid going deep down into that. But the whole idea is simply the law from Deuteronomy 19 is being used by Jesus to defend himself ultimately before the accusations of the Pharisees. Right? They're claiming you're the only one that's claiming all this. There's no one else that's supporting you with this. And
right,
he's actually pointing out the Father is actually in support of this too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the funny thing, though, it is interesting, right? Because in John's gospel, he does not have the scene of Jesus's baptism. But I would almost I'm just thinking from just a canonical or just from a synoptic gospel perspective. You have the testimony of the Father, and then you also have the testimony of the Spirit. The fact that the Spirit came down upon Jesus, that
hmm
you should listen to this guy. That ultimately this is the person you ought to be listening to, and so anyways, it is interesting, but I think the usage of this by Jesus is to actually just push back against the Pharisees of I do actually, there are two witnesses, me and the Father, and that's more
right.
than enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, let's jump to a quick commercial break and then we'll come back and we've got three final questions, all centering around Deuteronomy 32. Surprise, surprise. So we'll spend a lot of time there. So let's take a pause here real quick. If you're not already reading with us, we'd love to have you start reading today. Every month in the Awakening Bible community, we read a book or several books of the Bible together. Readings are only 1 to 3 chapters a day, 5 days a week, with weekends reserved for catch-up or deeper study. And as you read, we know that you will likely encounter questions, but that's where we come in. Submit your questions at AWKNG.com, and we will do our best to get them answered for you right here on the Ask a Scholar podcast. Welcome back, everybody. Let's dive straight into all of our Deuteronomy 32 questions. I know that there's always lots of questions around this chapter, and so I'm going to read off the first one, and then after that we've got 2 additional ones, so we can spend as much time as we need on these. So the first question says in Deuteronomy 32:15, it seems Israel is called by another name, Jeshurun, I believe is how you pronounce it, but it doesn't seem to show up anywhere else in the Old or New Testaments. What does the name mean, and why would God use this name only in Deuteronomy? Is there any significance about it in chapter 32 that we should note?
The word actually occurs 3 times in Deuteronomy and
Okay.
then once in Isaiah.
And
Isaiah
did I say it
44.
right? Did I even say the word right?
Yeshurun in Hebrew, but
Okay, cool.
Jeshurun in English is fine. That J sound. I always wonder, should I say the J or not? Because when you get into Israel, everything's a Y, and
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's fine. Um, so yeah, Yeshurun as a term occurs 4 times, and once in Isaiah 44:2. Thus says the Lord who made you, who formed you from the womb, and will help you. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, Yeshurun, whom I have chosen. So the Anchor Bible Dictionary, again, a good place to look for something like this. They recommend, this is a quote, a poetic reference to Israel, either as a people or a place. And then it mentions the 4 uses. And it says, coming from the root yashar, which means to be straight or right, the term is an ideal reference to Israel, meaning the upright one. So it's probably just a poetic reference to Israel, which again, in the Old Testament, you can call Israel by all sorts of names, including Israel or Ephraim. Oh, well, now I'm blanking on all the different ones, but you can guess in the prophets, you got a lot of them coming out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I just sense it is.
Across the Bible dictionaries that are, I mean, they all pretty much agree on the idea that yes, there are 3 references in Deuteronomy, 1 in Isaiah. What I did find interesting, it was in the Baker dictionaries, and then later on the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. They alluded to this idea that those 3 passages in Deuteronomy and then the one in Isaiah, there seems to be a connection to how Jeshurun or Israel is this beloved servant of Yahweh. That there's almost like this. It's all in poetry, right? That Deuteronomy 32 is Moses' song, and so it's
Yeah.
in poetry.
So kind of
Isaiah's
like a
44.
descriptor, is that what you mean? Like it's a descriptor of it?
No, it's a poetic name. It's basically almost like the technical name they would say it's a diminutive, but there's also, I would almost want to say, if I were to boil it down to something that someone could understand today, it's a pet name.
Okay,
It's a special name given to a beloved one. And
gotcha.
it's interesting that even the Septuagint translation of this, they translated it as the beloved one. And so
Hmm.
there's this connection that seems to be that yes, it's a poetic name. It's a name that has affection, and it seems to be surrounding this concept that Israel, you're my beloved one. You're this servant that has a special mission in this world. And so anyways, I don't know if there's anything more that we can say about it besides just that the context of where that name's being used seems to be at a place where God is poetically describing Israel in a very loving and very poetically beautiful way. And it seems to be connected to their ultimate mission as a people, which is you are meant to be a light to the nations.
Yeah, that's great.
I like that pet name idea. Mike's pet name for Drina. Anyone know what it was?
I don't.
No.
Queenie. I'd often hear it.
Oh, that's sweet.
So
That's a great.
that makes good sense that
Yeah.
when you're talking in loving terms of Jacob or Israel or
Yeah.
Ephraim, you make up words that
Right.
define them, and so uh, Jeshurun or Yeshurun seems to be that one or one of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. Okay, so the next question centered around this chapter says Dr. Heiser often talked about Deuteronomy 32:8 and said the phrase at the end should be translated as sons of God, But other translations like the NIV, the CSB, and the New King James Version, and others all say something like sons of Israel or people of Israel. Why are the translations so different, and which one is correct?
Yes, Deuteronomy 32:8. Let me read today's English version. I like how it sounds. The Most High assigned the nations their lands. He determined where peoples should live. He assigned to each nation a heavenly being. If you compare that version with the CEV, RSV, New RSV, uh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 7 or 8 others as well, including the net version, ESV as well. You have the sense that it ends with this term, B'nai Elim, that God assigned each nation according to the B'nai Elim. So here is, and go to my slide. This is, again, wouldn't you know it, I go to the Jewish Study Bible to see what they say. It's underlined, verse 8. Let me make it strong, tighter there. This on the very, very bottom left is how verse 8 ends. Well, let me read it. He set the divisions of man. He fixed the boundaries of peoples in relation to Israel's numbers. Now, that's the old Tanakh that was translated back in the 70s. That, in other words, this is their base text that the Jerusalem Publication Society uses in the Jewish Study Bible. But look at the note to the right side. Israel's authors regularly applied El's title to Israel's God. Even the precise parallelism rock. Let me drop down. Okay, go to the area that's in italics. In relation to Israel's numbers, that would be the text variant that would read according to the number of the sons of Israel, which is how they translate it as in relation to Israel's numbers. Okay, but notice what the Jewish Study Bible admits. This is unintelligible as it stands. The variant attested by the Septuagint and at Qumran, according excuse me, I'm so sorry. According to the sons of El, which is reflected in the New RSV, which preserves the mythological reference to Most High earlier in the verse, makes much more sense. Here, the idea is that the chief god allocates the nations to lesser deities in the pantheon. So the Jewish Study Bible is admitting that, and you can let go of the slide at this point, that what you have is a textual variant, and this happens all over the Bible, right? And when it comes to studying Old Testament, you have a whole set of rules for textual variants that are quite different from the New Testament, because in the New Testament the Bible was copied many times, and we have thousands of copies of copies of copies.
Yeah.
Whereas an Old Testament textual criticism question is basically limited to what does the Septuagint read? What do Qumran texts that we found only 100 years ago? What do what do they show? Because we just have such fewer or much less volume to work with. But most versions, and like I say, the ESV has it this way, the NET has it this way, and if you read the study notes in any good study Bible, they will generally admit that because of Qumran and the Septuagint, the most likely reading was that when God established, and let's reread the verse then, when the Most High assigned their lands, he determined where people should live. He assigned to each nation a B'nai Elohim, a B'nai Elim. In other words, that a God class being he assigned to each of these nations. And so this is where the Deuteronomy 32:8 worldview, Mike, that Dr. Heiser liked to call it, or a divine council worldview gets its impetus, is that in a verse, not just in Deuteronomy 32, this is repeated in Deuteronomy 4:19 and 29:26, that God established the nations based upon giving them these beings that would be, quote, or shall we say, in charge or left in charge. And I think Paul even refers to this in Acts 17, that the reason he did this was that they would search for Yahweh. So the purpose of this giving of these gods to these lands was not because God didn't like them. It seems that Paul had a hopeful version of events to follow, that these beings would help people find Yahweh. So I'll leave it there. That's really the question of the asker, the questioner here. which version is correct? I would say undoubtedly, and I would again go just quote the Jewish Study Bible. They think it should be the sons of gods or God class beings. It makes most sense.
Um, I guess my response, if I could bring up here, I have on my area, Gods of the Nations by Daniel Block. He has an interesting note about this particular verse, and he has his own translation. But he specifically pointed out that in 1951, the scholar named Skihan had argued for the priority of the Septuagint, the LXX. And eventually, once you get to the scrolls and the manuscripts that were discovered in Qumran, that's essentially where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they find that there is actually a manuscript fragment that mentions Deuteronomy 32:8, and it actually has the B'nai Elohim that alludes back to the Septuagint version, which is, I think, it would be translated as sons of the angels. But again, essentially, the supernatural or divine being class persons. And so, what's going on here is that it seems to be that what we have in the majority text, that in the Masoretic text, you have this kind of nonsensical sons of Israel. But the earlier texts, and even from the Septuagint, that is probably based on another like manuscript family, that they're attesting to that the words in Deuteronomy 32:8 mentions sons of gods or sons of God, this class of beings, or essentially these divine beings. And it just goes into that narrative again of how in after the aftermath of Babel, you had people groups that were having their own different languages and different tongues, but there was still this sense of a guardianship, a custodian that was watching over these different peoples. But Israel was going to be now Yahweh's focus to try to develop them as a people to be later on a light to the nations, a priesthood, a kingdom of priests. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing. And when the English translations are going into it, it really is kind of about their translation philosophy. Do they prioritize Masoretic texts and using that as, well, that's how it's always traditionally been translated, so we should just translate it as sons of Israel? Or other translation philosophies that are, well, this seems to be more of an earlier textual variant, but it has a stronger connection to probably what the autographs, to what the original text looked like. And so we probably should go with that. And so what you're seeing in the two different kind of translation philosophies is, do I honor tradition or do I honor what I have been finding in the research?
I want to pause you guys right here because I don't want to assume that everybody listening knows what the divine council worldview is. And it kind of hit me. We probably should have talked about that a little earlier on, since there's so much context that interweaves itself through these questions. So if I can ask you guys, I know that this might be a tough question, but can you just give the listeners a quick overview? Obviously, if they want to learn more, they can take Unseen Realm 101 or Unseen Realm 102, or they could read, Dr. Heiser's books, things like that. But just give just a quick overview and how it connects in to what is being said in this passage of God assigning these beings over the different nations. If you can just kind of give a big picture.
That's a good point. I would say it this way, and then obviously, Mike, you can help me out here. Think like the biblical writer and author, number one, so that when you're reading the text, you're asking, what would they have thought?
Mm-hmm.
What would they be led to think by what they're hearing? If they do that in the Old Testament, a divine council worldview would recommend, as a full brush worldview, that Yahweh is the creator deity of all things physical and spiritual. That includes some spiritual beings, an unknown number of host of spiritual beings who are very involved in the story of the Bible, and including the idea that, like we saw in Deuteronomy 32:8, a number of them were placed in charge of the nations outside of Israel, so that each nation would speak as their God, my God, your God. And it was not just tribal, but even national, how they thought of it. So included in this worldview is that these gods seem to, as you follow through the story of the Bible, these gods, many of them seem to become disloyal to Yahweh and become almost an enemy of him, and that they lead people away from Yahweh worship. And then by the time that Jesus comes on the scene, he is going to be facing them even through the demonic possessed people that he meets and so forth. And by the time the New Testament story ends, Jesus has ascended through his life, death, and resurrection. He has ascended to a place of authority over them. And this is where Paul then picks up language of principalities and powers and things like that. So the reason we call it a worldview is because once you get these beings called gods of the first commandment, real and active and powerful, then many other dominoes start to tip over in our translation and understanding or interpretation of the story of the Bible. So, what do you want to add to that, Mike?
I think, and I've said it in other interviews, and when folks would ask, like, what is the value of a divine council worldview? And I think one of the immediate benefits for me as I learned about it was that it really introduced and really brought up the stakes of what we are called to do as Christians, which is to call people to a loyalty and allegiance to Jesus the Christ. And the reason is because there are actually real rivals to the worship of Yahweh, to the love of Yahweh. There are actual divine beings or spiritual beings who are there, who are actually actively pushing against not just the worship of Yahweh, but they are desiring and wanting the love and affection of different people groups. And as weird as that may be for a 21st century Westerner to comprehend, and yet it does bring up the stakes of that what we are doing is more than just simply trying to convince a person to ascend to an idea. We're actually trying to inform a person that there are genuine stakes. There are beings who are there, who exist, that are purposely trying to win your affections and your love. And what ultimately Jesus the Christ has done is that he is the one that has defeated all of these other rivals who, for really the most part in the history of what we understand from the ancient Israelites perspective, from the ancient Near East culture studies that we have, many of these people groups felt they were enslaved by these other gods that they had to worship. They did not feel like they had a choice because they lived on this God's land. I have to worship Marduk. I have to worship Baal. I have to worship this because if I don't, this God may kill me. Versus because of what Jesus the Christ has done, we have a choice. You can now choose to give all of your loyalty to Yahweh alone. And he has defeated those other gods. And so to me, I think the value of the DCW is that it really does actually make more real the actual stakes that we are playing with in this desire to tell people about who Jesus is. I constantly remember how my lead pastor, in the trips that he's taken to India, for him, once he started learning about the DCW, and then he went to India and he's seeing literally the worship of other gods all around him, that there
Yeah.
is actual contention, not just contention for Yahweh, but ironically, all of these other gods are also contending against one another. And it made it more real for him to realize there is an actual, when we say spiritual battle, we're not talking about like with swords and spears, but we're ultimately talking about the loyalty and the affections and love of human beings, to which God will they follow.
That's great. Thank you
That's
guys
well
for,
said, Mike. Thank you.
yeah, very well said. Both of you hit on key points that I just think are crucial for people listening to understand so that they can get some background context around some of these answers that you guys have been giving. So thank you for that. Okay, one last question on Deuteronomy 32, and then we'll wrap up. It says in Deuteronomy 32:17, my translation says, they sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they have never known. I thought demons were Elohim, or divine beings, as I heard Dr. Heiser used to call them. But the text seems to say that demons are not divine beings. So what are they then?
Yeah, the ESV has that were no gods. The Jerusalem study, or the Jewish Study Bible, has they sacrificed to demons, comma, no gods, comma, gods they have never known. The New King James has they sacrificed to demons, not to God. So there is a bit of a challenge just in the
Mm-hmm.
translation. But when you go to the Jewish publication footnotes again, page 442, they say this language is intentionally sarcastic, because you have down in verse 17 the idea of no people will be your biggest enemy, and the idea that the no language or the nothing language is comparative. It's sarcastic. So, like in Isaiah 41:23, show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are Elohim. Indeed, you are nothing, and your work is nothing. But then, one chapter earlier, Isaiah had said, all nations before Yahweh are as nothing. They are counted by him as less than nothing. So, this nothing language, or the no language,
Mm-hmm.
lo in Hebrew, doesn't have to mean not existing. It can just mean not powerful, not authentic, in the sense of the kind of, the real compared to the inauthentic. So you have a lot of this in the Bible, that. And this is a fair question. And a lot of people, and this is where I was for most of my life in my
Mm-hmm.
teaching ministry as well, that I don't believe in other gods, because you have this Isaiah language that they don't exist, or something like that, or even the NIV puts the word false in front of them. But then here's the switch for me, and it was for many, including Mike, and I'm sure for you, Mike, as well, that this is comparative language, and even the Jewish study notes tell us that this is the kind of language you would use in poetry to render the opponent powerless. You would call them a nothing.
Mm-hmm.
My dad can beat up your dad. Well, my dad created your dad. Imagine if that was the way that story would go in the playground. That's kind of how Isaiah does it. He'll say, you make this idol out of wood, and with the shavings you make dinner. This is stupid. And but what he's trying to argue is that Yahweh is so powerful, so above us, that how can you ever have the sensibility to worship not just the idol, but the God that even has come into the idol. So, could I show my slide one more time here?
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a story behind the title of my dissertation. It used to be, when I first sent it in, it was Paul's identification of principalities and powers, and it was rejected. My dissertation at Dallas Seminary, because, as my reader said to me, it's all about the Old Testament. It's all about the gods of the Old Testament. And I was just downhearted. I thought it was all over. And my wife, literally, this is a true story. She's here overhearing this in the kitchen, and she writes on a 3x5 card, "Tell him you'll change the title to the Old Testament background for Paul's principalities and powers," as you read it here. And the guys and my reader said, "Oh, okay." So that's the title of my dissertation. And really what it is, it's a guise of saying, let's look at the gods of the Old Testament to see, A, if they're real, B, if they're powerful, and C, if they match up what Paul does with the
Mm-hmm.
principalities and powers in the New Testament. And
Yeah.
that's all I did. And one of my readers did ask me, you're going to have to convince me that the gods of the Old Testament aren't demons. So just like
Mm-hmm.
our questioner asked,
Yeah.
are the gods, or are demons Elohim or not, is a good question. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just have 3 pages. And in my dissertation that just take this on, the first sentence: in the Old Testament's portrayal of hostile evil powers, there is a severe lack of interest in demons, and that's true. You're not going to see the word demon hardly anywhere in the Old Testament. Bottom of this, or the next paragraph: the beings known in the Old Testament as demons are notoriously hard to define. Just so everybody, that when you get into Old Testament demonology, it becomes a difficult discussion. So, depends who you read, you're going to have a different view. Um, Look at the middle paragraph there. In the New International Version, the word demon only occurs in Deuteronomy 32, here it is, and Psalm 106, where it translates the Hebrew plural of shadim. But watch what happens here. The derivation of this term is uncertain, though it may likely come from a root that means to rule. And I don't show the footnote there, but footnote 102. If this is the case, it appears that we are back to the approximate setting of Deuteronomy 32:8. It's only eight, 8 verses away,
Mm-hmm.
in which the world was apportioned out to ruling spirits, B'nai Elohim. So, can I read this last paragraph? Thus, we have no biblical evidence to say that Shadim are anything less than Elohim, class beings of the Old Testament. To call a shade a demon appears to be the same problem we face in calling an angelos an angel. We necessarily import traditional meaning into the term which the biblical writer could not have known. The common and traditional meaning of demons being fallen angels is unwarranted, therefore, at least from a biblical perspective. They may be much more than that. Thus, our appeal here is to not downplay the role of the Old Testament Shadim by passing them off as mere demons, all the while not knowing exactly what these beings are.
Mm-hmm.
Here's, this has happened, and I've made this case a lot with you, Mike, on our own podcast, is we we get rid of the gods by calling them angels
Mm-hmm.
or demons.
Mm.
And then we don't even know what an angel or a demon is. And that's, because that's a transliteration from a Greek term. So I would recommend that Shadim are beings, Deuteronomy 32:17, that are Elohim. They seem to be related to, quite carefully, the rule of the gods in the world somehow in the Old Testament story. Again, if we're asking, did people really believe that? I would say at no point in the biblical story do people stop believing that. All the way through Paul, he's going to talk about them as 7 times authorities and rulers over the nations. So the way he talks about them in literally the same way that the book of Deuteronomy talks about them, I find to be very authentic. In other words, the biblical story does believe that there are actual sentient divine beings. If you don't like the term gods, if it upsets us because it sounds too close to God, capital G, that's fine. That's just a vocabulary issue to me. They are Elohim class beings. They're created. So we do
Mm-hmm.
believe in monotheism. There's only
Right.
one creator, but there
Mm-hmm.
are these other beings that God has created that just play a very pivotal role in almost every page of our Bible. So,
Mm-hmm.
The way that I would think of it, and maybe I'll start off with this kind of funny illusion. In context, I'm a Bostonian. And so this would be all, if I were to try to give a modern version spin of this in a humorous football analogy, I would probably say Eli Manning is no GOAT. GOAT being greatest of all time player. Um, Tom Brady is the GOAT. And like what you were mentioning earlier, Ron, right? That this is essentially it's trash talk. It's basically trash talking
mhm,
that that these demons, these shadim, these apparent rulers, they are so that you can't even consider them as divine beings. You can't even consider them gods. And yet, ironically enough, right, the even in this translation where it says to gods they have never known, that second phrase presupposes, but the gods exist.
mhm,
And that because but they had never known them. They were not their gods, and yet they still try to sacrifice to them. And so like when I said earlier, Eli Manning is no goat. I'm not saying that Eli Manning, in some people's minds, would be considered the greatest of all time player. Just that in reality, the truth is Tom Brady is the goat. Um, Sarcastically wise, but what I'm trying to ultimately point out is that the wordage of what's going on again, because Deuteronomy 32 is a poem. You have a very poetic way of essentially this trash talking all of the other gods, and essentially all of the other gods that Israel will be encountering as they enter the land. And again, I think this is part of Moses's plea to the people. It's like you have to stay loyal to Yahweh. He is the goat. Like he is the
mhm,
greatest of all time, not these other gods that you're going to be encountering.
Mm-hmm.
And even the gods that you had been sacrificing while we've been walking around here in the wilderness. It's Yahweh alone. Like this is what I'm trying to leave with you as a people. Before I die, you have to stay loyal to Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of like what I felt it was going on within Deuteronomy 32 is this is really Moses' last try to convince the people to stay loyal. and after this, there's nothing else he can do. They will have to make their own decisions.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you guys for all your thoughts and wisdom on these questions. Ron, any last resources that you wanted to highlight? I know you shared some in the last episode. Is there any missing that you want to also highlight?
No, I guess nothing comes to mind. I would just say again, as I generally say, is just read everything.
Yeah.
Make your spouse tired of hearing about the next book you want to buy, if you can. Just but tell them it's a tool, right? This isn't a book. This is a tool.
Yeah.
So
Well,
um,
on that topic, I love that you said that, because my fun question for you, because we know you're such a reader, and I remember on one of the first episodes that we asked you that question, you said your favorite thing to do on your day off was just to read. I believe it, read and study. So I'm going to flip the question a little bit and ask you, what's your favorite fiction book? So give us like a fun read, not a learning read, but more of a fun read.
fun. I'm not a fiction. I'm not a fiction guy. So, because the first thought I have when I see a fiction book is it didn't happen. Well, what good is this? If it didn't happen. So, anything that Lewis wrote, what Paralandra, the second of the three-part trilogy, Paralandra is. I read it over vacation last month again. Is just fascinating.
Okay.
So yeah, that's my favorite.
I love that you could only think of one. That's great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us again and for answering all these questions. Thank you, Mike, for your additional insight as well. And we hope that you guys will join us again as we cover, we're going to cover Joshua and Judges next together as a pair, right, Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, so that'll be our next reading plan, and then we'll have two scholars on, in addition to Mike and then myself answering questions on behalf of all of our students that submit them. So it'll be a fun episode, so make sure you stay tuned for that.
Thanks for both of you. By the way, Mike, having you, bounce off things. I've always loved that, and this has been fun for me again to learn from you. So thank you.
Awesome. Well,
Always
thank
a
you.
good time, Ron.
Yes, very much so. And we know we'll have you again eventually. So I'm sure we won't, none of our students ever get sick of you. So you'll be back on at some point in time. If you're enjoying the Ask a Scholar podcast, click follow on your podcast listening app to subscribe. Want to help further our mission? Consider becoming a monthly partner at AWKNG.com and help us make an impact in the lives of others all around the world as we work to make biblical understanding accessible to all with no exceptions. Join us next time as we get more of your Bible questions answered. And don't forget to visit AWKNG.com to engage in all our biblical resources that we offer.